One of the reasons I don't think it's really going to help the planet was summed up very succinctly by a professor called Miles Allen, who works with the Leap School at the University of Oxford here and has served on the IPCC's committee. And he was quoted as saying that, yes, we could eliminate the methane from cattle, and we get rid of them all. And this would impact and lower global temperatures by a few tenths of a degree over the next 20 years. But, he said, if we do not get to grips with the global warming being caused by fossil fuel consumption, pretty much everything else is irrelevant. Cattle take up 80% of our land or the Earth's land mass, agricultural land, and they provide just 18% of the calories. As if calories were the point of everything. Calories are not the point of everything. Protein and nutrients are the point of everything. So, yes, livestock take up a lot of land. They provide close to 50%, or 40%, of protein. And that protein is immensely more higher quality, more bioavailable, better protein than the plant protein. So you begin to think, well, is that such a terrible trade-off when we're getting that quality protein out of the land? Yeah, interestingly, the other day, a study came out from Our World in Data, and that study looked at a whole range of those old meats versus the real product. And it showed, like most data from Our World in Data, which is also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, of course, so there's a link there too. It showed that animal proteins were vastly more environmentally costly than these fake meats. The difficulty with that, there are two difficulties with that. First of all, the numbers that they had in terms of emissions for real meat were based on a study that was done a couple of years ago by Poor and Nemechek, which is the go-to study, which really overstates the carbon costs, the carbon emissions associated with meat in some parts of the world by up to 6 times. So I know that it overstates UK beef by 3 times. And in some parts of the world with some beef, it's overstating it even more. So that's damning the real product before you even get out of the gate. The other thing, which is not mentioned by Our World in Data, is that those fake products are not nutritionally equivalent. They're not the same. So to say that they have a lower carbon cost is really pointless unless you're looking at the range of nutrients, the quality of the protein, and comparing apples with apples. So I think we're very far from being at a place where we can conclusively say that these fake meats are better for the environment.
Welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast with your host, Leigh Brandon. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and a warm review. And now, here is Leigh, the Radical Health Rebel, with this week's podcast.
Welcome to episode 22 of the Radical Health Rebel podcast. This episode is entitled The Great Plant-Based Con with Jayne Buxton Part 2 and follows on from episode 21, where I interviewed Jayne on whether a plants-only based diet was optimal for human health. If you haven't watched or listened to that episode, I suggest you do so before listening to this episode. In this episode, Jayne explains whether a plants-only based future is the solution to save the environment and to prevent global warming. So enjoy part 2 of this interview on the Great Plant-Based Con with Jayne Buxton. So the other thing we haven't spoken about, Jayne, is quality of food. Now, obviously, the other thing that has to be considered is the quality of the food. As you mentioned, you spoke about earlier about, caged animals. If an animal is living in a 6x6 or even smaller cage, and they have to do everything in that space, including going to the toilet and eating the food and they don't get any exercise, well, you can't produce a healthy animal in that environment. And if you compare that to an animal that can roam freely and eat its natural diet, so for instance, for sheep or cows, that would be grass rather than grains. That's the other thing that we really need to take into consideration when we're talking about a healthy diet. It makes a massive difference, because if you've got toxic chemicals in the soil and you're growing plants in the soil, well, then you're going to have toxic plants.
Yeah.
So, that's another thing that often people don't consider is, well, I'm vegetarian, therefore I'm healthy. But actually, if it's not grown in healthy soil, it's not going to be healthy. It's going to be toxic, as I mentioned, but also it's going to be nutrient depleted, because,
well, that's the point. Yeah.
When they put these chemicals in the soil, it kills the microorganisms that actually create the nutrients for the plants. So that was just something I wanted to mention before we moved on. Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And we have evidence that the nutrients have declined in some of our vegetables over the year. Now, the extent to which they have is much disputed, and there are a number of studies, but there is a decline. There is definitely a significant decline. And that's because the soil, as you say, that cycle of feeding back nutrients from the soil into the plants is not taking place. And there are other reasons too. Because some plants are picked too early in order to transport them and get them over to the other side of the world. And that affects the nutrients in the plants too. So there's all kinds of things in our current food system which act against high quality, high nutrient density food. So you're quite right. We need to think about the whole thing in the round, and it becomes a really complicated issue. And we can talk about the benefits of eating grass-fed beef, not only for our health, but for the environmental impact and the welfare of the animal. But
that was going to be my next question. Yeah. So my next question is, do you think a plant-based diet will help to save the planet?
I think that, I could answer you that no very quickly as well, but I'll try and be more expansive. One of the reasons I don't think it's really going to help the planet was summed up very succinctly by a professor called Miles Allen, who works with the Leigh School at the University of Oxford here and has served on the IPCC's committee. And he was quoted as saying that, yes, we could eliminate the methane from cattle, and get rid of them all. And this would impact and lower global temperatures by a few tenths of a degree over the next 20 years. But, he said, if we do not get to grips with the global warming being caused by fossil fuel consumption, pretty much everything else is irrelevant. That's a big statement. Everything else is irrelevant. So, yes, we could have some impact if we stopped eating meat, but it would not make a difference that would be significant enough to the world and to global warming. It's a bit like rearranging the deck chairs, that's what it is. And in countries such as the UK, that is particularly the case, because the emissions that are generated by cattle and sheep, beef cattle and sheep, amount to approximately 5.8% of our total here. Well, transport of all kinds is 24%. You have industrial and residential use, that's about 35%. You have energy at another 20%. So you have these massive generators of emissions, and this tiny one over on the side, which we're paying way too much attention to. Now, that is also, that point is made more significant by the fact that those emissions, I believe, are exaggerated in the first place. So there are many ways in which the emissions allocated to cattle are disproportionately high. So one of those problems is that we're using a metric which is not really suitable for measuring the emissions from cattle. So we're using a metric called GWP 100 instead of the new recommended metric, which is GWP star. And so the old metric, the 100 metric, it has been acknowledged, overstates emissions from cattle by about 3 to 4 times. Overstates the warming effect of emissions from cattle by 3 to 4 times. That's pretty significant, 3 to 4 times overstatement. You know, there are numerous ways. Those numbers don't take into account sequestration. Now, your listeners are probably aware of what sequestration is, but in case they're not, sequestration is a process by which a farming practice, can help the soil to draw carbon out of the sky. So it's a net benefit to the environment. And cattle raised in the right way, on the right pasture, can create those conditions for sequestering carbon, for storing it underground, which is exactly what we want. And that's where it should be, not in the sky, underground. And that the ability of cattle to do that is really underestimated in all of these numbers. And people talk about these numbers, these emissions numbers, as if they're fixed in stone, as if they're accurate to the 10th degree. They are a moving target. We're constantly learning that one sector has more, another sector has less. Just last week, it was reported that the methane from industry has been vastly understated. So we have to stop pretending that we have this fixed emissions pie and that we know exactly who's contributing what to it. It's much more of a movable feast than that. It's much more complicated. And in the process of trying to simplify it, we're demonizing cattle, which is actually probably the least important of all the problems that we have to fix. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't do better. We can do better.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? We can do better by implementing practices, regenerative farming practices more widely, because they're not very widely used, and improving that sequestration ability. So that's where we really need to be moving.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this isn't something that you wrote in your book at all, and it's something that I've been looking at for a few months now. You spoke about global warming, but have you listened to any scientists recently talk about global warming?
I have, and I'm very much aware of. I believe where you're going with this is whether we're exaggerating the warming effect, whether it is actually made by man-made activities and that kind of thing. Is that what you're?
No.
Oh, okay.
So I've listened to a few experts recently, and they say, but the Earth hasn't warmed for 20 years. There is no actual warming.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that have completely denying that it's even warming at all anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not to say we shouldn't stop pollution, but they're actually saying that there is no global warming, and there hasn't been for 20 years.
I'm aware that there are people that are saying that. The science that I have been looking at does show that there has been global warming, but that it follows a cyclical pattern. And we don't know the extent to which human activities are driving that pattern or affecting that pattern. You know, it could be a lot, could be a little. It is happening. But for instance, sometimes it's disconnected from human activity. So in the period directly after the war, emissions were going down and industrialization was going up. So sometimes it doesn't make sense, the connection between human activity and global warming. It isn't a subject that I choose to engage much on, because I need to be heard on on the environmental impact of cattle. That's what my battle is. The environmental impact of meat inclusive diets is where I want to be working and arguing the case. If I start to get into the whole question of does global warming even exist, that's a major distraction in terms of the ability to solve this one problem that I'm facing. Is that clear? Am I making myself
Sure. Yeah.
I think you can
that's fine.
only take on so many battles at once. But yes, I'm aware that there's a lot of fluid science out there. The science is not settled on many of these issues.
When I was interviewing Matt Letitia the other week, because me and Matt are the same age, and he was saying to me that, do you remember back in the 70s, we were told that we were about to go into an ice age, and that we were all being scared to death that we were about to go into an ice age. And then, there's other people that have said, well, by the year 2000, most coastal towns will be under 20 feet of water. Mm-hmm. And then you look back now and sea levels are exactly the same as they were 40, 50, 90, 100 years ago, Mm-hmm. So I guess we have to be a little bit careful what we believe, I guess.
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult.
So you've spoken about methane, but I know you also speak about carbon dioxide in your book as well. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, only that methane has become the bad boy in the story. Methane is what's generated by cows burping. And I notice that most of the time people talk about methane and they talk about cows and they say cattle are responsible for 30% of man-made methane. Now, that's very convenient because it makes the cows look quite bad. The reality is that cows are responsible for 15% of all methane because much of the methane that is generated is natural. It comes from natural sources. So one of those natural sources is wetlands. So wetlands generate more methane than cows. And that's not a story you hear very often when people are talking about doing rewilding and let's transfer the pasture over to wetlands. It would not result in a net reduction of methane. So methane is misunderstood. At the same time, the difference between methane from different sources is also misunderstood. So the methane from the cattle forms what is known as a biogenic cycle. So it is coming out of the cows and it goes up into the atmosphere. It is converted by hydroxy radicals into carbon dioxide, which is then absorbed by the soil that the cows are trampling on and making better and making more capable of absorbing carbon dioxide. So there's a kind of cycle there which does not exist with industry. So the kind of methane that's coming from factories, from industrial plants, or the carbon dioxide which comes from those is a different category altogether. The carbon dioxide, which comes from fossil fuel use, is coming out of the ground for the first time. There's no cycle in there. There's no limitation on it. Mm-hmm. It's out of the ground into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. That's why it's so dangerous. That's why really Miles Allen is correct when he says we've really got to address that or everything else is irrelevant. So.
Gotcha. Another thing you talk about in the book is, I guess, the criticism of livestock and their use of water and land. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in terms of water first, it's often said that, cattle are a big water hog. And if you look at the totality of the water that they use, you could reach that conclusion. But the fact is that 95% of the water which is used by cattle is rainwater. It's not irrigated water. It's not dredged up from lakes. It's not nothing. It's not brought in. It's rainwater. And that water would fall on the ground, whether the cattle were on the ground or not. So it would just, if the cattle were not there eating the grass, then that rainwater would just really kind of go to waste in a way. So it's not a net draw on the ecology of the system. So land is connected with that in a way, because what would happen if the cattle weren't there? Well, the cattle do take up a lot of land. It's undeniable that a great deal of the world's farmland is used for cattle. It's also true that 70% of the world's farmland, and the percentage is very similar in the UK, 70% of that land cannot be used for growing crops. So it can only be used to grow cattle, as it were. A farmer who I interviewed, he raises pigs and he raises cows in Devon, and he said you have to grow food in the right place, and what grows in Devon is grass. You can't grow anything else. It's very hilly, and it also grows cows very well because cows love the grass. So you're growing these two consistent forms of food and nourishment in the right place. You can't. It's extremely naive to think that we could just simply get rid of the cows, change all that land over, and grow food on it. Now, a lot of people say the current argument is, well, we don't need to swap that land over. What we'll do is we'll rewild it, take the cows off it and rewild it. And then we'll take a little bit of the land and grow some more crops. Again, I think the numbers that I've seen from studies that purport that argue for that case are very dubious, and there's a lot of work still to be done on whether or not that's possible. There was a study done in Scotland by a group of researchers called Leigh et al. And they discovered that in the Scottish environment, for instance, if you were to swap over from animal protein to plant-based protein, the amount of land that you would require to grow those plant-based proteins would be just the same as the amount of land that you're using already to feed those cattle. So you're not really getting a gain in land use in an environment like Scotland with that particular topography and everything else. So it's super simplistic to look at that kind of land use and make judgments on the basis of that alone. The other thing, which I find annoying, irritating, and again, overly simplistic, is when people say cattle take up 80% of our land or the Earth's land mass, agricultural land, and they provide just 18% of the calories. As if calories were the point of everything. Calories are not the point of everything. Protein and nutrients are the point of everything. So, yes, livestock take up a lot of land. They provide close to 50%, I think, or 40%, sorry, of protein. And that protein is immensely more higher quality, more bioavailable, better protein than the plant protein. So you begin to think, well, is that such a terrible trade-off when we're getting that quality protein out of the land? But you won't see the Guardian using the protein number or the nutrients number. If you add nutrients in there, it's even worse.
Yes. Well, we'll come on to someone that funds the Guardian, but not just yet.
Yeah.
So with regards to farming practices, can you talk a little bit about things like monocropping, ploughing and tilling?
Yeah. So this is something that has come to people's attention recently, that the thing we used to think about agriculture, which is it's quite normal to plough up the land every year and to replant and to regrow the same monocrops on that land and just to keep feeding it with fertilizer. That was a way of farming which was encouraged because it was supposed to be high yield, and in the post-war period after the 1950s, it was going to generate more yield and feed the world, and it became the norm. And it's only been recently that many farmers have realized what that was doing to the soil, which is it's destroying the nutrients in the soil, destroying the carbon content and the organic matter in that soil, which results in less water retention, leading to floods, with less carbon storage, which is why we have a problem with excess carbon in the atmosphere. So there are numerous problems which are caused by that way of farming, and farmers are starting to move to what they call regenerative practices, which do not ever till the soil. They don't overturn that soil. So they don't disturb the life in the soil, and they don't release the carbon. And it's a difficult way of farming initially to get to grips with, but a lot of farmers are finding it immensely beneficial, and they're actually measuring the benefits in their soils. So here, there's a farmer called John Cherry who founded the Groundswell Festival, which has thousands of farmers attending it every year, who are just talking about these principles, trying to learn from one another, trying to implement them on their own farms. And he said we were so stupid for so long, we didn't realize that we were destroying the soil, and now I can see it. I can see it coming back. I can see the life on the farm coming back, the birds, the bees, butterflies, the other habitats, because we're not disturbing that soil, we're protecting it instead. I'm not pretending that's easy, and I'm not a farmer, but
yeah, I remember seeing a documentary a few years ago, and there was a lady who, she inherited this farm. She grew up on the farm, but it was her farm, and she was saying, "Look at this video from 1974." And her dad was on the tractor ploughing the land, and there were flocks of birds following the tractor. And then she said, "Watch this now." So she got in the tractor, started ploughing the field. There was no birds.
No.
None, not one. Wow. And, that's just an illustration of what you just said. You're just killing the wildlife, And what do you think that's doing to the environment,
Yeah. And that's why I find it amusing that the Audubon Society in the States has a phrase that they use, which is, what's good for the herd is good for the bird. So that's an acknowledgement of the fact that if you are raising cattle on the land in the right way and allowing those cattle to do their thing with the soil, pooping on it, trampling on it, eating the grass to the right level, not right down to the ground, but the managed level, that's good for the herd. It's good for the bird, because the birds have something to eat. They're feeding off the insects in the poop. They've also got habitats there because of the ground, the way it creates those habitats. And they're not being poisoned by the kind of chemicals that you often find associated with monocrop agriculture. There's great, huge fields of corn or soy, which are, grown year after year with the help of artificial inputs. That is no good for wildlife.
Yeah, I was thinking as well, as you were talking, ploughing obviously kills animals, right? If there's a mole, if there's a mole in the soil and a plough comes along and, it's going to decapitate the poor thing, And
the earthworm.
So it sounds like it's a much more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously the other thing is, if you're not monocropping, obviously you've got more than one crop in the same field. What often happens is that, plants have different root structures, and they're reaching out to different levels, actually taking different nutrients from different levels of the soil. So you're even, it's better for the soil. It's better for the vegetables as well, if you're not monocropping.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of farmers are now wanting to move back to that way of farming, that mixed farming and the rotation. So so you're using cover crops to protect the soil in some years. Your cattle graze on those cover crops, which gives them food. It rests the soil. You don't have to plow it, and then you're rotating and you're growing a wider diversity of plants as well. So it's that's the goal. I'm just not sure we have the right government policy right now to assist farmers to move in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, we have actually, I'm just going to mention something that is quite apparent today, and I don't want to go into it too much detail, but it's pretty disgusting what's happening in the Netherlands at the moment with the farms. I don't know if you're up on that.
Do you know,
where the government basically said,
I've been following it only in the same way everybody else has. I'm not an expert on what's happening in the Netherlands, and I think it's extremely problematic the way they're going about the change. But it's also, the Netherlands is problematic because they're quite an intensive farming country. They're farming a lot of animals and a lot of crops on a small amount of land. So it is true that intense farming, it isn't something that we should be looking to see as part of our future. How you transition from one form to another is the question for that government. And I think there are a lot of questions to be asked about whether they're doing that in the most fruitful, humane, and supportive way for those farmers. And I would suggest probably not. Yeah.
I mean, in episode 5 of this podcast, it was called "If I Was the UK's Health Czar."
Right. And
one of the things I suggested was that we transfer over a 5 to 10 year plan to change our farming methods. Now, at the time I said organic, but actually, looking back now, I should have said regenerative. And what they're obviously doing in the Netherlands is saying, well, you need to change tomorrow.
Yeah.
And not giving the farmers any time, not giving them any time at all to make that adjustment. Yes, we want to get rid of that kind of farming, but you can't just do it tomorrow. It's going to take time. You might say, right, these farms in this region are going to go first, and it's going to take them a bit of time, and we've got to support them while they do that.
Yeah.
You can't just say, well, as from tomorrow, you can't. Yeah, I was going to say, you can't say as from tomorrow, you can't. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay.
Tick box policy, isn't it? It's sort of, we need to tick the box of immediately reducing our nitrogen and our emissions. So we're going to do that in one fell swoop by getting rid of everything. Whereas the other policy, which you're talking about, which would be supporting farmers through transition, might take 5-6 years to have an impact on the temperatures or on the amount of emissions, let's say. So it's politicking. It's not really helping. It's politicking.
So we've got a famous computer billionaire who is heavily invested in some of these fake meats, and he's also heavily invested in genetically modified crops and wanting to patent every seed on the planet and have us pay him so that we can eat. What are your views on these fake meat products and genetically modified foods? Thanks for watching the Radical Health Rebel YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to share with your friends and family, or share via your social media. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to receive notifications of new video clips from the podcast. And if you want to watch the full episode, completely ad-free, plus premium content, and join the Radical Health Rebel Patreon community, head on over to the Radical Health Rebel Patreon channel at www.patreon.com/Radical Health Rebel. Thanks again for watching.